It's 2:14 in the afternoon. An agency officially closes a file. On paper, their job is done. But, this isn't a story about paperwork. It's about what happens when a system designed to protect people, just breaks, and someone is left behind in the wreckage.
See, in the real world, nothing was closed. The person they were supposed to be supporting, someone who needs 24/7 care, was still there, still sitting in their provider's home. The daily schedule on the wall didn't just vanish. The need for medication didn't stop. The system turned the page, but for the provider and the client, you can't just do that.
Okay, so let's get into it. How did we even get to this point? Well, this whole crisis kicked off when the talks between the home-sharing provider and the agency, we'll call them IFRC, just completely fell apart. And we're not talking about a simple disagreement here. This was a total, absolute dead end.
And you've got to understand this was not a two-way street. IFRC put a contract on the table that basically shoved all the risk onto the person actually doing the care. They flat out refused to change terms that were unreasonable, maybe even unlawful. They ignored emails, they ignored arguments from the provider, they even ignored the concerns of the client. And then they just shut the whole conversation down. End of story.
And this is the moment where everything tipped over. IFRC sends out an official notice of termination. Game over. From their point of view, that means they're out. They're no longer the middleman, they're not in charge, and, this is the big one, they are no longer passing on the funding.
So for the agency, that file gets a big closed stamp on it. But for the provider and the client, who, remember, still lives in that home and can't be left alone safely, the real nightmare was just getting started.
In a system that's actually working, a contract ending isn't supposed to be a 5-alarm fire. It's supposed to kick off a process, a planned transition. Let's take a quick look at how this is all supposed to work, in theory.
The ideal way is super clear. It's logical. An agency gives notice, sure, but then it's their job to organize a smooth transition for the person they're supporting. They're supposed to create a plan, help find a new contractor, and make absolutely sure care continues safely without any interruption. It's all about a smooth handoff.
And really, this quote says it all. No gaps, no cliff edges. The entire point of the system is to make sure a vulnerable person doesn't just fall through the cracks when the paperwork changes. At least, that's the theory.
Okay, so now let's pivot from that nice, clean theory to what actually went down here. Because the reality? Well, it was a whole different story.
To really get this, you have to look at the chain of responsibility. It's supposed to flow from the government to the funder, an organization called CLBC, then down to the agency, IFRC, and finally to the provider and the client. But the very first link that snapped was the agency, IFRC. They just walked.
And what they didn't do is maybe even more important than what they did. They didn't organize a transition. They didn't hand the client over to someone else. They didn't check in to see how the client was doing, or even just to make sure they were safe. They just left a huge gaping hole where their responsibility was supposed to be.
But hold on, the failure doesn't stop there. The next link up the chain, the funder, CLBC, they were told what was happening. They knew a vulnerable client was now with a provider who had no contract and no funding. And what did they do? They also failed to step in. No emergency plan, no new agency. The chain didn't just break in one place, it broke in two.
So, if we boil this entire mess down to a few simple questions, a really clear and kind of disturbing pattern starts to show up. First up, who stops the contract?
Simple. The agency IFRC. They did. All right, so the next obvious question, right? Whose job is it to plan the transition to make sure the client is safe?
And the answer to that is the real gut punch. Nobody. The spot where a plan was supposed to be was just empty.
Which brings us to the final and maybe the most important question of all. With the agency gone and the funders sitting on their hands, who's left actually doing the 24/7 work? The home-sharing provider, the one person with no official power, no contract, and no money, was left carrying the entire weight of this broken system.
So let's really unpack what that means for the person left holding the bag. Because this isn't just an inconvenience. It's a truly impossible situation. It's a moral trap, set by the system's own failure to act. I mean, look at this. The provider is facing this impossible choice. Option 1, you stop providing care and you put the person living in your home, a person you care for, in immediate serious danger. Or option 2,
You keep providing that care for free, burning through your life savings, destroying your own health with no end in sight. There is no good answer here.
And here's the deepest irony in all of this. In that moment, the home sharing provider becomes the only part of the system that's still actually working. The very person abandoned by the bureaucracy is the only thing stopping a complete disaster for the client.
So by now, you can imagine there were phone calls, emails, desperate attempts to get someone to do their job and set up a proper transition. But the response was just a long, deafening silence. A failure that didn't get fixed in a day or even a week. Let's put a number on the official response, shall we? The number of transition plans they provided, 0. The number of backup providers assigned, 0. The amount of emergency funding they activated, 0. Just a total and complete absence of support.
So what happens when that silence isn't just for a few days? What if the answer you get from every single person whose job it is to protect a vulnerable person is nothing for 139 days? That is how long this was allowed to go on.
In our next explainer, we're stepping right into that silence. We're going to look at what it really means, day in and day out, when a system walks away, but a provider refuses to. This is where the story really begins. This is day 1.